Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to UCL. For those that don't know me, I'm Paul Eakins. I'm Professor here and Director of the Institute of Sustainable Resources, and tonight is one of our 3 annual ISR lectures. So it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Professor Dieter Helm, our chair for the evening, Professor Georgina Mace, who is Director of the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research, and she'll welcome Dieter properly in a minute. I just need to give you some domestic announcements. We're not expecting any kind of fire drill tonight, so if the alarm goes, there's a fire exit at the back, or you can come through to the front, so make your way with minimum panic. And after the lecture, as is our wont, we'll have an opportunity for refreshments afterwards. But that's enough from me. I'll now hand over to Georgina to get the evening underway properly.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. So welcome everybody to this ISR special lecture. It's a pleasure for me to introduce this, a pleasure to do this on behalf of the ISR. I had a very enjoyable evening earlier this week listening to the Christmas talks from 17 or 18 PhD students in the Institute for Sustainable Resources, which was fantastic. It's even more of a pleasure for me to introduce Dieter Helm, who's our speaker this evening. So I've had the great pleasure and a very interesting time working with Dieter over the last few years on the Natural Capital Committee, a subject close to what he's talking about this evening. Dieter is a professor of the University of Oxford, a fellow of New College, and a professorial fellow in the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. As I say, he was the last chair of the Natural Capital Committee that ran from 2012 to 2015, and he's just been reappointed, he's just been appointed to the new Natural Capital Committee, not a reappointment, it's a new committee, for the committee that is now recruiting for the next 5 years to fulfil this government's commitment for natural capital planning. So there's plenty in store for you to hear about from Dieter. He's mainly talking today about valuing the planet as in his book, but I'm sure much of this will have relevance to the Natural Capital Committee. So please join me in welcoming Dieter Helm for this evening's talk.
Georgina, thank you for those kind words. I was hoping that I would still be a free man this evening and not chairman of the Natural Capital Committee, so I wouldn't have to say at the beginning that these are personal remarks, although many of them may coincide with things that the new Natural Capital Committee will be engaging in. Please, for the record, take all my remarks as mine and mine alone. I can't say that they should be ascribed to the other members of the committee because we haven't appointed them yet, so at least they escape that. So thanks very much. What I'd like to do today is cover quite a broad canvas. I want to explain to you what the natural capital approach is all about. I want to persuade you that it's a better way of looking at the natural environment than the traditional sustainability concepts. I want to explain why asset-based approaches in particular are of particular importance. I want to explain how the concept is operationalized in terms of measurement, in terms of accounting, and in terms of the choice of policy instruments. I want to explain to you what the policies are that follow from taking the natural capital approach, and I want to convince you that there's an enormous economic prize at the end of this process and lots of practical things that can be done. And in that last bit, I'm hoping very much that the new Natural Capital Committee will be doing it. The first Natural Capital Committee spent the time defining the territory, setting out the metrics, setting out the framework, and persuading all the main political parties that we needed a 25-year plan to restore and enhance our natural capital. And I have to say, the metrics would not be what they are without Georgina's fabulous contribution to that process. I've yet to succeed in persuading her that she ought to be on the next Natural Capital Committee, but I'm working on it, Georgina, hard. So that's my ambition. And my book sets out the broader framework for all these things. But I'm going to try and pick out some of the core elements this evening, and of course answer as many questions as you might have. And if you have questions that you don't get through to me this evening, or satisfactory answers, you know where to find me. Just email me and I'll try and answer the questions subsequently. So the starting point is, what is natural capital? And the answer is really simple. It's everything that nature gives us for free. Full stop. Now, I'm now going to demonstrate what an appalling photographer I am by showing you only one slide which has a photograph in it, which is this one. When we say everything that nature gives us for free, we mean a huge range of things. And the three bits that this picture is supposed to represent are take examples at the start of the book. At one level, we've got non-renewable natural capital. I'll explain that in a moment, but it's stuff we can only use once, stuff that nature's given us for free, and North Sea oil and gas is an obvious example. That's natural capital. How we use it, the way we use it, where it fits into the environment is an important component. Most of our societies today, almost all of the wealth that we've got has been built on depleting non-renewable resources like oil and gas in the North Sea. The second kind of natural capital in this diagram is the sort of natural capital that comes from our river systems, and if you follow the news, even the slightest peripheral way, you'll see what happens if we don't manage our natural capital properly by looking at the pictures from the Lake District, from the Derwent and from Carlisle and from Cumbria. Rivers, the way we run river catchments, are all part of what is naturally provided to us, and these are parts of our assets and we need to manage them in a particular way. But the third point I wanted to illustrate on this diagram, this picture, is this. Where am I working? No, there you go. Okay. Well, no, don't worry about it. I'm used to these things, so I'll put myself. So on this side here, this rather blurred couple of pictures. Okay, that's a 5p bit, the little circle at the top. This is a dwarf panther. It's absolutely tiny, and you'll find it in just two places in the UK. You'll find it on Briar, which is the most westerly island in the Isles of Scilly, on one tiny little meadow near the sea shore in little hollows. And you'll find it also on the lizard. I'm not sure where, because I've never found it on the lizard. That's natural capital too. And it's extremely important natural capital because it illustrates a point I want to demonstrate as we go along. Most people will never see this thing. Most people could never think, in fact, I can't think of any uses this stuff has. I can think of the use of the river, and I can think of all the things we use that natural capital for, but I can't think of any use for a dwarf panther. And it's also probably the case that virtually nobody would miss it if it disappeared. But it delights. It gives us pleasure. And it costs virtually nothing to conserve that dwarf panther. There's no other use for the meadow in which this is found. You couldn't possibly build houses on it. And a select group of people will go to enormous trouble to go and see this and take enormous pleasure and delight from it. So this is not just about things that are useful, it's also about things which delight. It's a term that Tom Smout used in his great book, actually, I think called Use and Delight, some years ago. So there's loads of stuff that falls under this category, and we've got to sort out which bits fit into which kinds of classes, and we have to think about what the economics are that lie behind those. So what I want to do, what I would like to do when I get the technology right, is first of all give you a context for the problem. I then want to explain the concept of sustainability in natural capital. I'll explain the asset base. I'll define some of the objectives. I'll advance a natural capital rule, which I think ought to be fundamental to the way in which we think about the environment, and then I'll come down to the policy, the funding, and the price. I'm going to comprehensively cover the territory. But to start with, to get the notion of natural capital going, to work out why it's worth thinking about this stuff again, we have to first of all realise the scale of the problem we're trying to confront. The scale of our problem is much more complicated than climate change. Climate change is really analytically easy. You may not think so, looking at all these people in Paris, etc., think it's easy. It may not be easy to find solutions, but it's just a bunch of gases, and it doesn't matter where they're emitted. And, okay, countries may not report their emissions properly. Certainly China doesn't. Many other countries don't. These things are poorly measured on a country basis, but we know how many parts per million there is of carbon in the atmosphere. And we know when that changes. And we've got pretty good measurement of that. And we know it's a small number of greenhouse gases we want to concentrate on. Biodiversity, the natural environment, completely different scale of problem. Okay? It's got multiple dimensions. Is it a species? Is it an ecosystem? Is it habitat? Is it genes? What is even the unit is a difficult question which I tried to push Georgina to answer for me repeatedly and got somewhere down the road, but it's quite different order of magnitude to climate change. It matters where it is. It doesn't matter whether Tata Steel emitted the carbon in the northeast of Britain or the carbon's emitted in China and we import the stuff back into Britain. Of course, by the way, by closing Tata Steel in Britain, our carbon record's much better, of course. The fact we import it is never much taken into account, and actually we're worse off by importing the steel and producing it home in terms of global emissions. But that's inside. And all these things overlap. They're different kinds of public goods, they interact with each other, so our problem is much more complicated. And the scale of the problem is truly enormous. It shares some of the features with climate change, but if the world's economy grows at 2 to 3% per annum in GDP terms, and it's been growing pretty continuously at 3 to 4, okay, China and India growing much faster, some of the developed countries going a bit slower, then the world's economy in 2100 will be 16 times bigger than it is today. If China was really growing at 7%, it's not, but if it was, if you believe the official statistics, then China will be 257 times bigger than it is today. And you can see that's a non-credible number. Now what 16 times bigger means is that if you look at the world's consumption today, we're going to do 16 times more consumption. I put it to you and challenge you, actually probably quite a few of you could do this. If I gave you 16 times your current income, what would you spend it on? Right? Okay, some of you probably could easily solve that problem. But if you think about it across the world's population, think of what that wall of consumption means. You take all the consumption we've got to at the level at the end of the 20th century, after an enormous transition, and multiply it by 16. I'll give you another order of magnitude. If India grows at the current rate it's growing at, it will be 2.5 times its current size in 2030. And by the way, it's not willing to accept a carbon cap until 2050. Think what another India and a half would consume and how much coal it would burn and how much the component is. Okay? So those are those numbers. This is in a world where we're going to accommodate 2 to 4 billion more people by 2100 with their consumption patterns, most in developing countries. And I'm not sure this is true because I'm not sure we even know how many species there are, but O.E. Wilson once speculated we were on path to eliminate half the species on the planet by the end of the century. Give or take a bit. Oh, we're going to warm the planet by well over 2 degrees because the pledges at Paris don't add up. So if anyone thinks this is a trivial question or a small-scale question, the challenge of living on this planet, keeping its climate in a reasonable form and maintaining its natural environment is up against some horrendously large challenges. Whether we succeed, that's another matter, but one should try. So now concepts. We've got all this natural capital, I've got my dwarf pansies, we've got the North Sea oil and gas, we've got the river systems, we've got all this stuff. How do we conceptualise this? Well, we split natural capital into 2 bits. And this really makes a difference. We split them between things that are non-renewable, like my oil and gas, which we're only going to use once. Okay? So it isn't about depletion. Somebody's got to have the stuff. Somebody's got to do the using of them. Okay? It's a question of who does and how they compensate other people who don't. Okay? Now, put aside whether you think the oil and gas should stay in the ground, and put aside climate change for a second. But my generation, we've had a fantastic party. We've depleted nearly all the North Sea oil and gas. We've had lower taxes and higher public expenditure as a result. We've saved absolutely nothing. We've bequeathed nothing to the next generation as a result, and you don't have it. That's the challenge. Now, most people would think a sovereign wealth fund is a way of allocating, and I'll come back if I've got time to how you actually do those rules. It's a perfectly sensible way of passing out the benefits from non-renewables across generations. That is a comparatively trivial analytical problem which was solved a long time ago. This bit is quite different, the renewables. And economics does not, in conventional terms, handle this at all well. Renewables, think of herring in the North Sea. Okay, if you don't know what herring are, they're fish that swim around the North Sea, round and round. And if you go around the whole of Britain, you can find the remains of herring ports, where people used to go around the country, follow the shoals of herring, and pack them into barrels and ship them off and so on. So these herring are happily swimming around the North Sea, and we send out lots of fishing boats to catch them. Okay? Now, provided we don't catch too many, by which I mean provided we do not take the stock below the threshold where it cannot reproduce itself. Georgina's work, and it's in papers in the Natural Capital website, which we still have, about how you do these thresholds, where this is where the science comes in. Okay? They will go on giving you herrings forever, or until evolution catches up with them. So every single year, from now effectively to infinity, you can have more herrings, provided you don't take them below a certain level. Okay? So if you're an economist, what is the value of oil and gas? Easy to work out. You know what the price of oil and gas is, you know what extraction costs are, just do it. Okay? What's the value of the herrings? Okay? It's essentially an integral through time which is infinite. Right? Which tells you that you don't go around and work out what a herring costs. They're very cheap, by the way, if you go to a fishmonger's, okay, and multiply it by the catch and say that's the value of herrings. You have to do that forever. Okay? And this tells you why, A, conventional analysis undervalues renewables, and B, why it's so important that you do not deplete those renewables below the threshold by which they can reproduce themselves. If we extinguish the herrings, we don't just lose the herrings next year, we lose them forever. Okay? And that's an extraordinarily important part of the valuation. So the value is open-ended. They can be reproduced at zero cost. So nature keeps giving them free forever. There's no cost. They just swim around and they breed and they produce more herrings. Okay? And then the threshold defines the minimum below which you can go. It's not, of course, the optimum. You might want more of the herrings than the minimum. But here's the difference between the science and the economics. The science, the stuff that Georgina does, is all about this bit. It's about identifying a stock, identifying what that threshold is that you can't go below, and the safe limits around it. The economics is that it comes in after you protected the threshold to what the benefits are of having a bigger population than the minimum population that you can reproduce. And this gives you a shortcut too. Anything that's well clear of the threshold, you don't need to worry about. You don't have to worry about all the natural capital in the world. We need to focus on those assets which are renewable, which could become non-renewable, therefore depleted and extinct. Okay? So we want to know which assets are at risk of going below that threshold amongst the renewables, and we want to focus policy on those. Now, put aside for the moment, I've made it easy by choosing a species, and I haven't chosen a rainforest as an example for reproducing itself, or an ancient woodland, or an ecosystem, but the principle remains the same, that nature will go on giving this stuff for free forever, provided we're inside the thresholds, but we might want a higher level beyond that. So that's the key distinction, and there are rules for the depletion of non-renewables, which are, well researched. and I'll come back to them in a moment because those become important. Now, natural capital is not about utility. It's not about the standard currency in which almost all economics is defined. It's about assets. Okay? And it derives from the notion that what we want to do is to have the enabling of an economy to function by ensuring that the economy has the set of assets within which it can then produce its outputs. It doesn't try to work out what is the set of assets that maximises utility through time. That's a subsequent and more demanding argument, and it borrows this from the Brundtland notion, which was the idea that each generation should ensure the next generation has a set of assets which are at least as good as the assets they found before. Okay, and the shortcut here is a set of renewable natural capital is a subset of that, and that set of renewable natural capital must be at least as good as the previous generation, and in this case cross the thresholds. Now, what does this do? It says that what we care about is three things. We care about the assets at risk, not just generally. We care about making sure that the assets that could go through the threshold that are renewable are passed on. And of course what that tells you is, if you want to bequeath the assets at least as good, it's capital maintenance you need to focus on. Just a core concept for accounting. We want to make sure that sufficient revenues are set aside to ensure the asset does not depreciate. Think roads and potholes. Okay? Capital maintenance of roads says you need a road system, you have to spend enough money to set aside to ensure that those holes are filled up. You can get by for a bit pretending that you're not really, you can live it beyond your sustainable standard of living by not bothering to fill up the thresholds, but you'll end up with a lot less species, perhaps 50% less, if you carry on in the form we have at the moment. I'll come on in a moment. Almost all national income accounts are in cash terms and they're not in assets, and there's no provision of capital maintenance. And that'll be the link across. And then the final bit is, of course, it's all about intergenerational equity. That's the bit of sustainability that's important to draw forward. It's not about consumption at a point in time, it's about a consumption through time and ensuring the next lot get at least the good outcomes us. Now the distinction between sustainability in the normal sense and the natural capital asset approach is that the way in which particularly economists have defined sustainability is to say the next generation should have as much utility as we do and not worry about from what sources that utility comes. So it's a continuous growth path of utility through time, a continuous path of consumption through time. In this term, it's a set of assets at a minimum level taken forward. And I can't distinguish this strongly enough. Shall I cut over that one? I might come back to it if someone asks. I can't stress strongly enough what the difference is between assets and utilities when we come to think about policy more generally. If you think about the welfare state, we don't in the welfare state, at least until recently, think that the job of the welfare state is to make people happy, to maximise their utility. What we say in the welfare state is there are some things that every individual as a citizen ought to have in order that they can choose how to fulfil their lives. So you must have access to education, you must have access to health, you probably need access to housing, you probably need access to transport. Soon you'll probably require access to broadband. What you do with those things, well, I mean, where I live, access to broadband would be wonderful. Prime Minister's promised it. You then left to choose your life as you might want to live it. It doesn't require the information to work out which assets make you happy or not. It provides those bases. And that's true for firms as well. You need a decent electricity system, you need a decent broadband system, you need a decent transport system in order that firms can choose how to maximise their production, how to build their factories. And what we're saying here is one of those assets is And you might think about it as part of the welfare state. It's one of those assets is you must have the set of natural assets in which you can live a healthy, decent life. You can make that choice for how you want to do that. You have access to green space, you have access to fresh air, etc. And companies need those frameworks of resources in which they can build their outcomes. So that's why it's assets. Now, this is the centerpiece of how you then translate this asset approach into the conversion across into policy. And I got to this rule by essentially taking seriously what the government here said back in 2011. 2011 there was a white paper called The Natural Choice. And that white paper says very clearly that it's going to be the first government, this is the coalition, the first government that is not only going to stop the rot in the natural environment, but it's going to leave the natural environment in a better state than it inherited it. Okay? So the white paper had a few ideas in it, but like all good white papers, had lots of ideas, not much idea about how to implement it at that stage, so they set up a committee to do it, and that's where the Natural Capital Committee comes from. Classic kind of policy approach. Now I take that seriously, and I ask the question, so if you really want to do that, and if you buy my starting point about how serious the problems are that we're confronted, it's pretty hard to argue that we've got too much natural environment. Okay? So you don't have to worry too much about optimality. The point is that given the amount of damage that's been done, given what's coming, you certainly wouldn't want less of it as an empirical proposition. So how do you operationalise that objective into a principle which you can then turn into policy? And the operationalisation of that comes in two rules, and these mirror weak sustainability and strong sustainability, but they're defined in assets and not in utility. The weak notion is that you must not deplete the aggregate level of natural capital, of renewable natural capital. So you can deplete bits of it, but if you do, you have to compensate by improving something else. That's the only way you can hold the aggregate constant for renewable natural capital. And that has an enormously important principle that follows from it, which is all about compensation. Okay? So we're going to hold the aggregate of renewable natural capital constant, and when we deplete non-renewable natural capital, which we're going to, think my North Sea oil and gas, you have to set aside the rents from that depletion so that you invest them in more capital for the benefit of the future generations. Okay? Now the difference between the weak and the strong, in my case, is it's all about what you do with the economic rents from depleting the non-renewables. Do you invest them in new renewable natural capital? Right? That's the strong case. Or do you just invest them generally? So what sovereign wealth funds do is they invest them generally. Okay, so people will draw down money from the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, and they'll spend some on roads, some on schools, some on infrastructure, and they might spend a bit on the environment. The Shetlands Islands Sovereign Wealth Fund is spent heavily on social services and physical infrastructure in the Shetlands. The second rule says you need to divert it into renewable natural capital, and that is the way, and probably the only main way, in which you could finance the restoration of natural capital. So remember, the objective is not just to stop the rot, it is to leave the next generation with a better natural environment. We found it. That's the origin of the 25-year plan, etc., which is much under discussion, which we invented in the Natural Capital Committee. So you'd have to invest those non-renewable depletion rents in renewable natural capital. And these rules are what follows from the policy objective. Now I want now to tell you what the implication of that is for the design of policy. First of all, if we're going to maintain the aggregate of assets constant, we have to account for those assets. Just in the same way as we account for factories, buildings, power stations, electricity systems, schools, and human capital too. Okay. And this leads into an extraordinarily important implication for public policy, national accounts, and how companies look at assets. So a company will have a balance sheet which lists out the assets it's got and the value of those assets, and it has effectively a duty to tell its shareholders if any of those assets are at risk. So it's absolutely normal to a company to have a balance sheet to put these assets in that frame. And we've designed in the Natural Capital Committee a template for how corporations should incorporate the natural capital for that asset base. That's pretty straightforward. The trouble is when it comes to governments, they don't have any balance sheets. There is no British balance sheet. Okay? Our sole purpose of national income accounts when they were set up was to do Keynesian demand management and address the old-fashioned Gladstonian question, which is how much cash is coming in and how much cash is going out, how to balance the books. That's what national income accounts do. That's what GDP measures. Okay? So when George Osborne stood up in the autumn statement and told us how our finances were going, he didn't tell you anything about assets at all. He told you about cash in and cash out and how we're going to balance the budget so the cash in and the cash out finally equalise. Okay? But I can easily think of ways in which I could make the budget position look much better. Don't bother to maintain the roads. Flog off the assets. If you privatise assets, they're cash in. No distinction between capital and current income. Okay? Of course, if you think that aggregate demand matters, and if you think Keynesian economics makes sense, you do need to know what these things are. I at least can, in my world, not think those are important questions and therefore can put that aside. But what you want is a balance sheet for assets if you want to carry through my rule. So I want to know what assets we have in natural capital terms, and I want to provide for capital maintenance. So I need to set aside enough money to fill the holes in the road, to make sure that herring stock's all right, to make sure all sorts of bits of our natural habitat are right, make sure the uplands in the river catchment for the Derwent in the Lake District are being properly looked after. Those sorts of questions. Okay? Now, the assets we're concerned about in the natural environment are different from physical capital assets in the following sense. These are assets in perpetuity. There's no depreciation. Right? You need river systems forever. Okay? If you build a new factory and you put the latest IT in, you depreciate it because in 2 or 3 years' time you're going to have something different. Buildings gradually depreciate, you take your money out, you take your investment out, and that's the end of it. These are assets we want in perpetuity. So therefore, there's no depreciation, the liabilities and assets don't go away, and then you need capital maintenance. So if you did this, no depreciation, and you provided a provision for the revenue of capital maintenance, here's the punchline. Our national budgetary position is only remotely related to what was told to you in the autumn statement, or by Gordon Brown before, or by anyone else. Okay? You know, if you want to know, are we living beyond our means? Can we sustain the economic growth path we are on? A minimum requirement is that you deduct the capital maintenance, and actually it's not just true for the natural environment, this is true for the electricity system, the water system, the transport system, the broadband system, and all the infrastructures of the economy. Okay? Go back. My generation depleted all the oil and gas. It was cash in. It's gone now. Okay? The growth rate was then only 1.7%, peak to peak and trough to trough in the Thatcher years, but it was pumped up by all that depletion. That's not sustainable growth. Right? That's not sustainable consumption. If you want to know whether you're living beyond your means or not, you know, if you go and flog your house and have a party, you don't bother to repair the windows, right? You don't paint the things, you don't replace the tiles on the roof. You could pretend you're better off because you haven't got to spend that money putting those assets into proper shape, but you haven't gained anything. It's not sustainable through time. Okay? So the accounting side would lead you to a radically different outcome in terms of what you thought the fiscal and monetary stance of the government ought to be against the consumption level of the population at any point in time. Okay? So you need there's no depreciation, you need the provisions. Now, of course, this is about assets. It's not about the pollution that comes from depleting the North Sea oil and gas. So you need your pollution charges, which are your taxes, carbon taxes, pesticide taxes, nitrate taxes, fertilizer taxes, all the externalities, okay, and subsidies where there are net positive benefits. And then it produces the outcome, a restatement of GDP at the end. Okay? And by the way, this is incredibly efficient. This isn't anti-economics. It's efficient to price pollution. It's inefficient not to price carbon. It's inefficient to deplete assets and consume the consumption from them without allowing for capital maintenance. This is the route to sustainable measurement of economic growth. And you can immediately see it would be a very different world from the world we're in at the moment. And the policies drop out of the rule and the accounting. It's pretty straightforward. If you buy my argument that we must maintain the value of renewable natural capital in aggregate, didn't say every asset should be preserved. I didn't say Swampy should stand in front of every bulldozer and every housing construction, etc. The rule simply says the aggregate must stay constant. Well, it follows automatically. If you damage natural capital assets, you must pay compensation. The compensation principle drops out automatically. Okay? That would be a radical difference. Imagine as those 200 or 400,000 houses are built, that the builders had to pay compensation for the damage to natural capital caused by those constructions. Imagine, if you think about the way in which farming works, that compensation had to be paid for the destruction of hedgerows, destruction of wildflowers, meadows, and all these kinds of things. An interesting thing is, it doesn't change what you do in the sense that either the net present value of the investment is a good idea or it isn't. Okay? Economics suggests that you make any improvement provided the gainers could compensate the losers. That, for economists, is the Pareto principle. Okay? You wouldn't do it otherwise if net present value wasn't positive. Okay? So it follows automatically the gainers can compensate the losers. Now here's the capitalist principle. What is a property right? How do you, when you look at what you own, what is it about it which makes you the owner? It means if I come along and pinch it from you, or I come through your house with a spade and start slashing up the pictures on the walls, you can sue me for compensation. This isn't a anti-markets principle. It's the absolute core of the idea of property, that if you damage property, you must pay compensation. And I'm simply saying, if you damage natural assets, these are property rights, these are assets, you must compensate. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean that you can trash anything you like, because it begs the question of whether compensation is possible. It's probably not possible to compensate for most ancient woodlands. You'd have to wait around a long time to get an ancient woodland back by definition. There are all sorts of bits of our natural environment which it's impossible to think of amount of compensation which would make it worthwhile ruining them. Okay? So in most cases, you know, the damage, you just don't do it because you couldn't compensate for doing it. But there are some cases where you can. And this causes grief in environmental movements because they say, oh, it's just a license to trash, etc. Okay? Well, I'm hopelessly pragmatic about this. We are going to build a lot of houses. HS2 is probably going to get built. Another runway is going to get built. I don't adjudicate whether these are good or bad things to do. So you can have a choice of two worlds. The first world you can have in which they're built and they do a lot of damage, or some damage to the natural environment, that's it. That's the story of the 20th century. Okay? Or you can say, whenever there is damage, there must be improvements which are at least as good as what's gone before. That's transformational. But you cannot meet the aggregate natural capital rule unless you do compensation. It's not possible. Unless, of course, one other option, you don't do anything. Okay? But that's not going to happen. We're going to have 10 million more people in this country. Okay? We're going to have a huge demand for houses. I suspect quite a lot of people in this room would like to own a house one day. Well, you know, you can't simply say that's of zero value. We live in a world where these are competing claims for resources. The question is, should the natural environment suffer as a consequence? And the answer on the aggregate capital rule is no, you do compensation. The second thing you deal with is the externalities. So lots of people go around damaging property without paying for the consequences. They're called factories and cars that spew out carbon. Okay? They're called farmers who put herbicides and pesticides on the fields and they go in the river system and then the water companies have to clean them up. It's not a criticism of farmers, not a criticism of people driving cars. It's simply to say we all engage in activities which cause externalities, and of course you want to price those. You don't want perverse subsidies. Why do we pay $3 billion to farmers to produce an output which is of limited aggregate value to the economy overall when we could do much better? And similar on the carbon side, you want a carbon price. I prefer a carbon tax. Other people like carbon permits. So let's not fall out over that. Okay? So if you put the tax in place, then you improve the efficiency of the economy. It is inefficient not to pay for fertiliser and pesticide damage to the environment. And it's very inefficient because you pay it in your water bills. Water treatment works are built to clean up the mess which has been put in into the river system, which comes from modern agriculture, amongst many other things. Okay? It's an obvious trade. Okay? And we get a benefit, sometimes called the double dividend, because we get the money from the tax and we improve the substitution efficiency of the economy. That's revenue. Okay? I can't resist just one point on perverse subsidies. You'll all have read in the papers that the perverse subsidies to fossil fuels is 500 billion, the IMF number. Okay? It's quoted by everybody everywhere. That is not. The subsidy is the difference between the production cost, $5 in Saudi Arabia, okay, and the market price, and the price they charge their domestic population. If the oil price falls by 60%, net of adjusting for the carbon price, the fossil fuel subsidies in the world have fallen by nearly 60%. Okay? It's really quite an odd argument. We want to get rid of perverse subsidies in order to make sure that we have we address the carbon problems properly, but if the oil price falls, people are going to consume much more carbon than they previously did, but the subsidy has fallen. So you have to be a bit careful about what perverse subsidies are in these circumstances. Okay? And then the final bit here is, of course, we want to charge the economic rent for the depletion of non-renewables, for shale, for oil, for gas, and that provides a fund which can be used for enhancing renewable natural capital. So, compensation principle, Pareto optimality, net present values, all good economics. Gainers can compensate the losers, and it's linked directly to property rights. And it meets the aggregate natural capital rule. You cannot meet the aggregate natural capital rule and damage some natural assets without compensation. Now, the funding frame, taking from those policies that I set out earlier, compensation, pricing pollution, and the depletion of the non-renewable assets, adds up to this very efficient outcome which requires no public expenditure at all, or no new public expenditure. Okay? The non-renewable depletion, that's your sovereign wealth fund. But in the strong aggregate natural capital rule, it's a nature capital fund, and you can put the green tax revenues into that as well, if that's what you want to do. You can do a general taxation, you put them in that frame. That is enough to do major green infrastructure, natural capital investments, and then at the other end, within the aggregate, that's the compensation, that holds the level constant. And sustainable economic growth is the combination of those two. That is the most efficient economy we could have. It's not that this is a constraint on economic growth as we imagine. That is the highest level of economic growth if you meet those conditions. So that's saying, of course, over time, economic growth can take place, but only driven net of the assets. And what does that tell you? It tells you, of course, technical progress goes on. There's nothing wrong with economic growth in environmental terms. It's only the wrong kind of economic growth. So if you want an example of an enhancement of economic growth, which seems to be pretty ambiguous, when I wrote my thesis, I did it with a typewriter and Tipex and carbon paper, and there were no fax machines, right? There's one or two people who might recognise that world. I can see they usually got hair about the same colour as mine. I've now got the most powerful computer I can imagine, and I can talk to people into this computer, and somewhere else they can hear it. When I grew up, you couldn't do that. You had to have a fixed phone, wait 6 months for BT to deliver it, and then you would talk into it, and then through the wires it would come out the other end. It's a completely alien world to most people in this room. It's a fantastic transformation of human possibilities. That's economic growth, technology driven. So it's not an anti-economic growth position. That's how we do the financing. That's the prize. That's how you do it. If that's your objective, and it is officially the government's objective, that's what you need to do to get there. And then my final slide is, so how would you get on with this? What would you do? Well, there's tons of stuff to do which meet these criteria. Big projects, small projects. There's my dwarf pansy. It would be really quite helpful if they kept some of the ponies off the little corner field in Briar at the end of the Isles of Scilly to keep those pansies in place, because the benefits that accrue to the people who go and see them are massively greater than any return you could get from the pony or whatever the grazing thing is. Okay? But it's also at the other level. Okay? And these are the things that hopefully the Natural Capital Committee is going to focus on, and these are the areas where the big gains are there and they can be demonstrated to exist. River catchments are clearly one example. And if you look on my website, I have a paper on how to do river catchments with system operators and so on, for those who are interested in water systems. But getting the trade between water companies who have to pay the cost of removing the pollution and farmers who get the benefit of putting it on, integrating farming, water and flood defence provides a much better allocation of the natural capital. The catchment of the Derwent will be very different under such a framework. Marine reserves, if you look at some of the benefits that are flown by the creation of those reserves, if you look at wildlife corridors and how they work and how they operate, if you look at what you could do with agriculture for the subsidy as opposed to what actually happens as the outcome. Agriculture is about 0.07% of GDP, which is about the same number as the revision to the national income accounts a year or so ago for the illegal sex and drugs industry. Very small. Actually, you may have underestimated the illegal sex and drugs industry, and you can ask questions about how they do the calculations. But the point here is, it's not a big bit of GDP, and a huge amount of it is just subsidy. That's not to criticise farmers, that's simply to say, we could do much better than that. If you look at the green belt, people say, yeah, build houses on the green belt, look, it's all low-grade agricultural land. What a lack of imagination. Just think what the green belt could be if people actually wanted to be green. What are the economic returns for doing that? Urban green spaces. We know the air quality in London is really seriously bad. It's not red alert like Beijing, but it violates the air pollution requirements, and it's seriously bad for you. And if you go running down the street in Oxford, in London, you must be questionable in your view about whether you're enhancing your health or not by breathing this stuff in, right? So green spaces within cities have enormous value. Okay? These are just some of the projects that you get going under this framework. And some of these projects are about simply maintaining assets at thresholds, but some of them are about enhancement or restoration projects which we could pursue in order to create a better and more sustainable level of growth going forward. So the point of that list is merely to illustrate that this isn't just theoretical, it's practical. Okay, so to bring it together, natural capital is about assets. It's about renewable and non-renewable assets. It's the renewable assets we should worry about. Maintaining these assets constant in aggregate leads to the rules I've suggested, and what follows from those rules is you need to do compensation, you need to tax the externalities, and you need to allocate the rents from the depletion of non-renewables. That creates the funding which finances not just the protection of the existing assets and the capital maintenance that goes with it, but the enhancement, and creates you more natural environment assets than you previously had. That's the way to achieve the objective of being the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state. And there's tons of things to get on with at the moment. You talk to any group involved in the environment, they will come forward with end projects of what we could do in the locality, in the urban space, in the region, in the country, and globally. Because back to my opening remark, Unlike climate change, this is an additive at every level, whereas in climate change terms, it's not necessarily a good idea to reduce your emissions if you're allowing someone else to increase their emissions in compensation elsewhere. So this can be done in the backyard, with kids with gardens planting flowers to help bees in a local area. It can be done on a larger scale with agriculture, it can be done with river catchments, and it can be done more generally. And that is the task in part of the Natural Capital Committee, but the framework that lies behind it, that's what I've tried to set up in my book. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dito, for such a wonderfully clear and comprehensive account of natural capital and making it all hang together in such a clear framework. So I'm sure there will be questions, and if you raise your hand, somebody will come and give you a microphone.
There are a few.
Okay. Yeah. Let's take a few at a time. One, two, three. Yeah.
Well, the big question is, how do you persuade our leaders to follow your natural capital or economics?
Okay.
That's an easy one.
Yeah.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. The green bond market is booming.
Yeah.
Investors cannot find projects that are at scale, which is above £250 million typically,
Yeah.
with a creditworthy issuer and
Yep.
a return on investment.
Yep.
How does natural capital methodology fit that equation?
Yep.
And we'll take one more.
So if you're removing farming subsidies, the likely impact is that food prices are going to go up, whilst you might see people's water bill going down. Is that really something that a politician can sell and get on board with?
Yeah. Shall I do the three? Okay. So they're all in a sense linked. The first and the last one are about, can you persuade politicians to do this stuff? Okay. So the first thing to do is to say this is not anti-economic growth. This is the only sustainable level of growth. So if you want to maximise economic growth, you have to do this. And if you don't do this, you might get away for a short period of time by things looking okay. But of course, in due course, you will fry the planet. And you will reap the consequences of the loss of all these things. And you will take the health consequences of the air quality in London. And you will take the consequences to health, etc., of the absence of recreation, and you will destroy the soils in the end, and you will lose your agricultural productivity as a result, and you will have to pay ever higher water bills to clean up the muck that's in the rivers, which you don't need to pay. Okay? So first of all, you have to be very clear. This is not an anti-growth environmental campaign. This is cold, hard logic about how you sustain the growth rate through time. That's the first point. The second thing you do is you pick examples which lower bills. Right? And if you're in a political game, you can't just simply whack something into the frame and expect everyone to sign up. Why should they? Why should they believe you? So you need some practical examples to show how people are better off if you do this. Okay? So example one. Okay? We at the end of the first term of the Natural Capital Committee, we got together, and I chaired it, all the people we could find involved in the Thames. And we tried to get people to think about the Thames as a whole. The Port of London Authority, through the Wildlife Trust, through the tourist people, etc., all in the room. And it was going quite well, but everyone was just arguing their particular case, and this can't be done, and politicians won't do this, etc. Until we got to the end and said, let's write down all the subsidies that are currently going into the Thames for environmental reasons, and ask ourselves, does anyone believe we couldn't produce more for the same amount? Or indeed more for less? Okay? So if we were to treat the agricultural subsidies, which you'll pay, right? Food prices include the consequence of the subsidy, okay? At one level we're allocating the subsidy. Personally, I would auction the subsidies and get farmers to bid the environmental improvements they can offer for the subsidies and give the subsidies to the people with the highest environmental improvements. Okay? This would lower nitrates, pesticides, etc., etc. On the other side, the water company's costs will go down. So the water regulator can reduce your bill. Why do you think you pay so much for your water? Right? This is a case where by taking an asset system like a river catchment, you can produce an outcome at least as good as the current one for less cost, or for the same cost, you can get more bucks for your money. Now the other side, which picks up the question about the green bonds, is the problem here, and the problem with carbon bonds, is where does the money come from? Where's the revenue stream that the bond investor gets their interest payment from and gets their asset back? Now this is where you have to distinguish between direct revenue flows. In the farming example and the water company, there are direct monies and direct trades. Indeed, companies like Wessex and other companies are already doing these trades. Okay? But in other cases like green spaces in London, it's not obvious who's going to pay you for that green bond. Right? But doesn't mean it isn't economically efficient and there isn't a cost function which explains it. So if we had green spaces in every urban area within 500 yards of every citizen, just to throw out an idea, okay, the cost of the health service will go down quite considerably. Right? If we planted trees down every street in London, I have no idea, you need a biologist to tell you the answer, probably tell you the answer, but I just imagine that for a moment, just one of those fantasies, that we just had everybody going out and planting trees down every single road in London. People would live longer, air quality would be better, health outcomes would be better. And remember, we're spending 100 billion a year on the health service. Okay? So it's about intelligently identifying in this case, the health service, as what are they going to buy? Hospital beds? Or are they going to be buying trees planted in a particular place? Think of the educational benefits. Think about the kids having playing fields. These things have returns. So we have a huge chunk of money going in, just like we have a huge chunk of money going to agriculture. The outcomes we get are inefficient. But we need to monetarise those, and that's when environmentalists get very upset. But actually, if you want to channel private investment into new natural capital assets, that's what you have to do.
Okay, let's come this side of the room. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Mario Di Conti, economist. On your additive point, I suppose the point that I would make is that if you're displacing agricultural land for environmental outcomes or benefits and you're reducing production, people still obviously need to eat, so that food will have to come from somewhere. But my question is around, I suppose, more about pricing and compensation.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you're talking about non-market goods here. So who would be the arbiter in terms of the values to place on these non-market goods? And how could we ensure that the appropriate value is being attributed to those assets?
Okay, just behind you.
That was my exact question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it's actually slightly related. It's also on compensation. You said that for compensation to happen appropriately, you need correct property rights. So the question is, what does that mean for ownership at the moment, particularly of land, and what are the associated rights with that?
So anyone else got one on the general theme of compensation? Yes. Yeah, okay, that's
Very much. Is that one?
I can hear you anyway.
Okay, so basically the question is, you said that if it was farming and you looked to auction the rights, now in an auction the risk then is you might not get enough availability coming forward. So what would happen in that scenario where not enough growers came forward to buy those auction rights? You still have to feed the same level of population, but now you've suddenly created a market where they can't necessarily afford to bid in and win the right to do that pollution. What happens in that scenario? Thank you.
That's it? Okay, so I work back, they're all related. Okay, so on the auction, all I'm saying is, supposing you don't want to change the amount of money you're spending on high-level stewardship, etc. Okay? And these schemes that are in the agricultural sector tend to reduce the yield, right, by effectively incorporating the environmental consequences, etc. of the frame. So supposing the answer was 3 billion, okay? So we spend 3 billion on farmers doing high-level stewardship, or whatever the scheme is, okay? And what do? Well, they're profit maximisers, they're very sensible. They do the minimum cost thing they can do to qualify for these things. Farm near me, you can see that the side of the fields are no longer cropped to the edge of the ditch. Okay? Hedge might be removed to make sure the ditch is further away so that you do the ban. I'm not joking, right? Okay? But it's just a road. Right? Trucks come down, there are no wildflowers in it or anything of that form. Other people will, have wildflower meadows and do things which keep pollinators and bees and other things going. Okay? So it's almost arbitrary how these things are handed out. So I say, let's take a catchment like the Thames. Okay? Now, there are certain things we want to do in the Thames which are system properties to the Thames. For example, we do not want, as I discovered the other evening walking on the Upper Thames, farmers ploughing up right to the bank of the Thames. Okay? This just puts the silt in the river and gets the runoff immediately there. You want pasture line. Okay? I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a scientist, but you can see that there's impacts of what they do. So it's not impossible to imagine a system operator for a river saying, well, if there's 200 million being spent in this river basin on agricultural subsidies, what is the best way we could spend that money for the highest net present value and therefore the highest level of sustainable economic growth? Okay? You wouldn't subsidise farmers around the Somerset levels to plant maize, right? Because the silt would run into the River Parrett and you'd have to spend hundreds of millions taking the silt out again after the Somerset levels are flooded. Right? So I would say, let's use the ideas farmers have got. Let's just say, anyone who wants a chunk of this subsidy, say 200 million or whatever, you bid in what environmental improvement, what environmental benefit will come. And then the system operator sits back and says, look at all these projects that come with great ideas. This is the best one. This is the one we should put most assets on. These aren't going to make any difference. And that means that the farmer is trying to maximise the environmental benefit in order to get the subsidy. Of course, some of them may not choose to do so. So I think that works. Now that links to the idea, someone mentioned food and you could grow crops on these things as well. Well, just remember that net of subsidy, there are some people who argue that agriculture contributes negatively to GDP in Britain. Some people think it's positive, but it's a very small number. Okay? And this idea of self-sufficiency, have you ever thought what it would mean to ban all imports of food, to do the Russian job, right? As they're currently doing, effectively, and think what that would involve. Okay? You cannot sustain a population of 60 or 70 million, right, on the land mass of this country self-sufficiently. Right? It would be fantastically radical. Next time you read the NFU setting out how we must be self-sufficient, you realise this is a non-starter. Okay? The question is, what food should we produce in this country in a sustainable way, which means the soils and the rivers and the other features of our economy are best managed. Okay? And that seems to me an important composition. So if I took a bit of the green belt around Oxford, for example, where people say the agricultural land is basically a green desert. And remember, the main point of modern farming, no criticism, is to kill everything else but their crop on their particular piece of land. That is what farming's about. It's about having no weeds, no insect life that does damage, only positive things, and everything. I mean, if you look at a field of arable crops, there's nothing underneath it. That's the objective. Okay? So if you look at that, and bits of the green belt around Oxford are just like that, people say rightly, if you put houses on that land, biodiversity will go up, because the gardens are worth more than the agricultural land. All I'm saying is, well, that may be true, but there are other alternatives you could do, where you could continue to have some food yield, you could maintain the soil through time, and you could have more biodiversity. You could plant trees. Ian Bateman has shown that the value of woodlands next to cities is vastly higher than the value of woodlands in the middle of Wales. Why? Because they're used by people who take value from tourism and all the other features that go with the benefits of having natural capital right next to cities. Now my trivial point, and you can see up on my website a paper called In Defence of the Green Belt, my trivial point is the one place you want natural capital to be is next to people. Right? And that's what the Green Belt is. Right? And the idea that you need to plaster these things with houses and that is necessarily the right thing to do, maybe in certain circumstances, but you have to remember about the welfare of these people. And people say, oh, it's just a nice middle class thing to look after the green belt, and it makes it more difficult for the poor to have houses. Well, the poor need fresh air. The open space movement in this country in the 19th century was all about giving lunch to the cities for the poor workers who were drawn into the urban environments. And health is just as important as agriculture. The question is, where do you want to do the production? And self-sufficiency doesn't carry that through. And that comes out of the property rights and the ownership of land. Of course, if you ask where do property rights come from, Marx's answer of theft is probably the right one. Somebody stole them once. The Vikings stole them, the Anglo-Saxons stole them, before that the Romans stole them. I mean, you know, if you want to go back to where is the origin of any property right, you end up in some very difficult position pretty rapidly. But that's not the point. The point is, given the land we've got, what's the best way of managing it? And if you have a society in which there is no clear property right, and you can have your property taken away by the Communist Party of whatever it is at any point in time, people will not look after the land. So I don't want to go to the territory of, is the Scottish land reform a good idea or a bad idea? And do people who have land have obligations? All of that seems to me a sensible discussion. All I was saying is, given any property rights, if you damage that natural capital, you must pay compensation. But I admit there's lots of distributional problems that come with that.
Okay, we're going to have a final round of questions. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Dieter, for a very interesting talk. I'm Dario Kenna. I run the website Why Green Economy. You started with the scale of the problem, and I'd really like to return to that to really try and see if the proposal you're making about natural capital matches the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
So I have just two parts of the question. On the one side, consumption. So you mentioned that consumption is due to increase by 16 times. You mentioned India, but just to bring it back to the UK, how would valuing natural capital actually reduce UK consumers' consumption, say, the palm oil in a food that we eat? So that's the consumption side. And then on the production side, you've referenced depleting North Sea oil several times, just to maybe look at what could be the future use of fossil fuels in the UK, which would be fracking. How would valuing natural capital make a company such as Quadrilla, who has concessions to fracking, how would it actually change its decision not to frack?
Okay.
Richard Bernard-Hall, environmental lawyer. I wondered whether how you actually decide what renewables should be invested in when you are depleting non-renewable resources. For example, the rare metals that go into solar panels. What actually do you do with that money? How do you decide where it should go?
Yep.
Hi, just related, Eric Lewis from the National Audit Office. Just following on the previous question on the scale of the problem, just taking that to an international dimension in terms of, if you look at the depletion of natural resources in Brazil, other major countries in the world. I mean, how do you see this approach being possibly taken forward in other major countries which are going to have much more impact in terms of natural capital?
Okay, so start with yours question, Eric, first. Okay, so of course, you can argue that worrying about the green belt in Britain or the backyard diversity in my village and the kids planting flowers, etc., for bees, are trivial compared with the fact that Indonesia is on fire again as it is each year. The scale of that smog is phenomenal, and the loss of rainforest goes on extraordinary. And as I make the point in my book too, there's this notion that there's about 25 global biodiversity hotspots that we really should worry about and we should focus our attention. Okay? So, a few things to say. The first thing to say is that what I'm saying is, and the framework I've given, is a way of analysing how much damage is being done. Okay? It focuses on the assets, not the eco-services directly, and it looks at those and it asks what is the capital maintenance that will be required, okay, and what isn't being paid and what's done. And you may think I'm totally naive, but slightly academic. I like to shine a torch on what's going on, and I like a conceptual framework of shining that torch so it's really clear what they're doing. Okay? The second thing to say is it tells you how much it would cost to stop some of this damage. Okay? So how much would it cost to prevent more loss of the Brazilian rainforest? Okay? Now, it's an open question about whether Brazilians are going to pay for that or we're going to pay for it, anyone else is, whether the red scheme's going to work, etc. But it's defined properly. It's like my point back here in Britain. You know, I say, if you, the government, want to achieve that objective you told us you wanted to in your white paper, I'll tell you what you need to do to achieve it in the most efficient economic way to do it. I can't make you do it, but I can point out with a torch very clearly what you're not doing that you ought to be doing to achieve that outcome. And I can point out some crass inefficiencies, for example, the way river catchments are run and the relationship between farming and water systems, which explain the outcome. And I can tell you why you get the flooding on the Somerset levels and why it's economically inefficient to get the flooding on the Somerset levels, because you shouldn't be paying people, farmers, to plough up through subsidies upstream hill areas around a catchment, etc. So I can do that. Okay? So that's the first thing. Second thing I would say is a point of optimism. One of the things that's almost been a plague to me when I chaired the first Natural Capital Committee is everyone around the world wants to come and talk to us about how you do natural capital and how you set up a Natural Capital Committee and therefore start shining their torches. It's been overwhelming. I mean, you know, I haven't got enough days in the week to do that. And the World Bank has the WAVES programme. There's a whole series of things going on. So you get a momentum for that, and I've got some other ideas of how this might be globalised and make a really serious global effort of this, like the way we do climate change, and try to make, well, not quite like the way we do it, but like the way we might aspire to do it in that front. The next thing is that I think that we should pay for the natural capital consumption that comes through imports. So if you remember my example of Tata Steel, okay, we measure carbon production in Britain, but not carbon consumption. If you look in my carbon punch book, I point out that measuring carbon production is not very helpful. Britain has reduced its carbon production between 1990 and 2005 by, 15%. It's fantastic. We ticked all the league tables, okay? But if you adjust the numbers, which is what I do in my carbon crunch book, and lots of people have done this since, and they get roughly similar answers. For the things that we used to produce, but we now import, Tata Steel, we import the steel now from China, instead of producing it there, our carbon consumption has gone up 19% in the same period. Okay? So it's our consumption footprint, which comes back to your question, which matters. And it doesn't, you know, you can't get away with saying, oh, well, you know, I'm not paying for the damage I'm doing in the UK, but I'm importing some mahogany from one of these rainforests, right? And you have to remember, a lot of the destruction in the developing world and the biodiversity hotspots is to produce exports for consumption by us. Okay? And one of the things you will discover, provided I can finally agree on the terms of reference for the new Natural Capital Committee, which is different from the old one, is that international dimension will be in the terms of reference. So I should be pushing that agenda quite hard on that framework. Now, on the what's our sustainable level of consumption? Okay, this is a really, really important question. Okay, so if you take what I've said about the national accounts and about the absence of provision for depreciation, for capital maintenance across the economy generally, and you ask, if we did this properly, what level would our standard of living be at? Okay, it's almost unavoidable to come to the conclusion other than that we're living beyond our means. Okay? So we can't continue with a level of consumption at the current level and meet our environmental objectives. That's where the demand for carbon comes from in large measure around the world, and that's where it comes on lots of these depletions of renewable natural assets. Okay? Doesn't mean it can't grow through time, but it means the current level is above that level. My generation consumed above the level which is sustainable because we used up all the money from the North Sea oil, the privatisations, and all the wonderful things we had. Right? So you have to ask, what's the baseline? What's our public discussion today? It's about austerity, about the fact that we're not consuming enough. Right? And somehow, a vast bulk of the population have convinced themselves that only borrowing 5% of GDP from the future generation is somehow sustainable. If you're an environmentalist, and most environmentalists I would make as an empirical observation in the political world tend to be of the left of the right, and I'm not of any of these persuasions, you should be in favour of austerity. You might want to do it distributionally in a very aggressive fashion. But you should say that continuing to borrow for the next generation, for some of the people in this room, you're going to pay for this, and you're going to pay for it very hard. That's like running interest rates below their normal level. You're going to have to pay more for a house, and that's why you can't buy one. This is where a proper balance sheet leads you to think through the sustainable level of consumption, and therefore whether a deficit is appropriate or not. Okay, so I'll tell you an alternative story about where we are in macro terms. We had the greatest boom in the history of capitalism at the end of the 20th century, spurred on by a technical change which was at least as big as the discovery of railways and the coming of electricity, a general purpose framework. People were led to believe that the future was always going to be better than the past, and therefore there was no point in saving. They might as well consume and borrow more because the future would pay back for it. There was an almighty crash in 2000. I point out to you the stock market is significantly below the level it was in 2000 today, 15 years later. Okay? And how did we respond to that? Not to say this was an excess boom and we need to rebase ourselves. On the contrary, we put bricks on the monetary and fiscal accelerators, dropped interest rates to negative level, and we increased public expenditure. In this country, public expenditure, and the US tax cuts. That was the response. We created the largest asset bubble the world has probably seen since 1929 as a result. That's what happens. And we have an almighty crash, and what happens? Our solution to this is to borrow 11% of GDP and drive interest rates even lower and start printing money. Okay? Now, the reason I make these points, and it's a different view about macroeconomics, is that if your question you're interested in answering it, what is the sustainable level of economic growth? And what is the sustainable level of consumption? It's a million miles away from a conventional Keynesian analysis of what our problem is. In my framework here, of course you're worried about short-term imbalances. Of course you run deficits and surpluses. Right? But the consumption level you've got is not one that you can sustain through time. And of course it can't be. That's why the last crash was bigger than the previous one. And that was bigger than the one in 1987. And that's why we have an asset bubble now which is of enormous proportions. Don't try and buy a house. How many times income is it? Tell me that isn't a house bubble, right? In the front. So that's the point here about consumption. But I am not putting that in a context of which many environmentalists do say we can't grow. Economic growth is bad. There's nothing wrong with economic growth. But you mustn't confuse that with the idea that the current level of consumption is the sustainable base on which growth should go on for. So everyone talks about getting back to 2007, 2008. And they talk about the output gap since. And they say we should borrow to drive demand up to that particular point. Really? Well, why does anyone think that 2007, 2008 level of consumption was a sustainable level of consumption through time? So if you take some dimensions of what I'm arguing in my book, they have quite radical consequences. Not for short-term or current or 25-year plans for natural capital, but they raise, through the national accounting, a whole set of questions about where macroeconomics is going. And when the Queen asked those economists, why didn't you see it coming? Right? My answer is, we wouldn't in those models. Way beyond my ticket.
Well, thank you all for your questions, which were very engaging and broad set of questions. And thank you, Dieter, for answering them so comprehensively. This topic has the ability to bring in a whole wide variety of disciplines, from economics through social science to law to natural science, and it's been really great to see some of that aired here. So thank you very much for your talk. I thoroughly recommend that you all go away and read Dieter's book, and I'll just hand over to Paul to finish off the proceedings.
Well, thanks, Georgina, and I've got nothing really to do except add my thanks to you for having taken us through this evening, to Dieter for such a splendid talk, and to invite you all to join us outside. And one last lot of thanks, which I sometimes forget, but I'm not going to tonight, is to thank all those who worked so hard to enable this event to take place. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you. Ellie, is it up there? It's Kieran up there, okay, and I can see them light. And thanks to Ellie, whom I saw earlier. So please, let's have one more round of applause and then let's go and have some